Talk about network troubleshooting for just a moment. So I've just simply written down a diagram here of just a simple connection. Here's my desktop. It's connected to a switch, connected to a router, connected to the internet. And let's assume that in general this works. But someday I sit down at my desk and I have no internet on my desktop. Well, I want to kind of troubleshoot why. How do I fix that? Where's the problem? Okay. Now, depending on what kind of device you have and what kind of access you have to it, the troubleshooting process will kind of change. For example, if I can log into this computer and I can sit down and look at the little network icon in the lower left corner, if this is a Windows computer, I can see if there's a problem or not. Now, if it's indicating that, hey, there's no problem, but for some reason I still can't load web pages, I'm going to follow one particular path. Maybe the little icon has a yellow triangle with an exclamation mark, which would indicate that there is a network connection, but it can't get out to the internet, which in Windows essentially means that it can't reach the DNS server out on the internet. And so it's going to have a little yellow triangle with an exclamation mark. Or maybe it's got a red circle with a white X indicating that there is no physical connection or that the Ethernet is disconnected. What are we going to do in each of these scenarios? Well, the more information we have, the more directed we can go. But if we don't have any information at all and we're just kind of blindly going in the dark, let's see what's going on. The first thing that I want to check is physical connections. Okay, now I'm assuming that the power's on and that my computer is actually running and that there's not an issue with my computer itself, but I'm going to start checking physical connections. Is there actually a network cable plugged into my desktop, and does that actually make it back to the switch? I'm going to look for physical damage on that wire. Now, I may actually look at each of these network devices as well. I'm going to walk into the comm closet. I'm going to check my switch. Does the switch have lights on it, or is it powered off or dead or unplugged or smoking or scorched? Something that would indicate that there is a physical problem with my switch. Same thing with my router, etc., going out to the internet. Now, lots of different places here where we can have physical damage that would cause a network interruption. Now, typically, if the switch is completely powered off or is dead, the desktop is going to have an indicator saying that there is no connection across the Ethernet cable. If it's saying that there is a connection across the Ethernet cable, it's unlikely that there is necessarily physical damage between the desktop and the switch itself. But again, we're going to start by looking at the physical issues. Okay, what are the physical issues? Now, the next thing, if we determine, okay, physical is fine. This guy's got blinking lights. This guy's got blinking lights. All the cables look intact. Everything looks happy. Maybe I've even got activity lights on the router and activity lights on the switch. It's a good indicator that, okay, maybe things are going correctly. If we don't have those activity lights, might also indicate a problem. I'm going to move down to my network or my IP address steps. So I want to make sure, does this computer actually have a good IP address? So I can look it up in the software. I can either use the command line or the GUI to find the IP address of this device. Now, if I see something like 169.254.31.48. This address might look familiar to you. This 169.254 is what we call an APIPA address, automatic private IP addressing. Essentially, if you hook a computer up to a network, it's first going to try and get a IP address through DHCP if you haven't manually configured one. If it's trying to get one through DHCP and it doesn't find a DHCP server, you're going to get this address. Now, that could mean a couple of things. Maybe your router, which is typically a DHCP server, isn't handing out addresses, or maybe it's handed out too many and it doesn't have any more to offer. There's probably something wrong with the DHCP, or you may note that there's not a connection to the router or to the DHCP server, which is causing you to get this 169.254 address, which would indicate that there's an error with DHCP. So you have a couple of options at this point. You could try and statically assign an IP address that you know works on your particular network. You'll have to be careful because you could cause an IP address conflict if you give yourself the same IP address as somebody else on the network. You can try and ping your router. See if you can actually use the command line tool ping and ping whatever the router's IP address is just to test that connectivity. Can I actually get to the router or not? If you can't get there, again, start looking at what's the issue between my switch and my router, or between my desktop and my switch. If you want to make sure that the issue is between the switch and the router, not just between the desktop and the switch, you can try pinging other devices that might be connected to this switch to make sure that you have connectivity with that. Ping is a great tool for point-to-point connectivity. Okay. It's available in all of the different operating systems, Windows, Linux, Mac OS X. It's a command line tool that you can use to troubleshoot point-to-point connectivity. Well, let's say that you do have a good IP address, that you do actually have a correct IP address. Let's say that it's something like 10.0.0.5. Okay, fairly low address, but for whatever reason, it is working and you can ping your router. Well, why won't your web page load? Well, to think through that, you kind of have to understand a lot more about how the internet works in general, how we translate URLs into IP addresses for your computer to talk to. But suffice it to say that we need to make sure we also have a connection to DNS, or the domain name service out in the internet. So again, we can use ping, but this time rather than pinging other devices on our network, we might ping a DNS server. A common one that people use is 8.8.8.8. This is the Google Open DNS server. So if you can ping that, that tells you that you do have a connection out to the internet. Set that as your DNS server, see if that corrects the issue. Now beyond that, if it's not a physical issue, if you determine it's not a network issue, then we're going to turn to the application or the operating system in question. Do we actually have an issue with one of those? Just as an example, oftentimes web browsers will get out of sync if the clock on the system is wrong. Their HTTPS is wholly dependent on system time. So if your system clock is wrong, web browsers won't load web pages that are encrypted with SSL or that are secure HTTP pages. So we may need to check into issues with the application and the OS. So kind of in summary, we usually start with checking physical issues on the network first, looking for physical damage, power, lights on all of these different connectors, all of these different devices that would indicate issues or the lack of issues. Then we're going to move up to the network. We're going to check IP addresses, and we're going to check DNS to make sure that we have a good connection there. And finally, if all of those other things, the physical and the network, are all in place, then we're going to check application OS, including driver software.